Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going well. You had a busy weekend. I got tired thinking about it. How were all your expos and panel discussions?
It was a great weekend. I'm also very tired, but no, it was super fun. For any new listeners here who've come to the podcast after hanging out with me and some other amazing people at the Athletics Ontario Race Director Summit, hello, welcome. So excited you're here. And yeah, big thanks to Athletics Ontario for having me come to their Race Director Summit. I got to speak on a panel about kind of creating community in running, really kind of answering the question, how do we bring more diversity to our race participation numbers? So the big challenge that I left a lot of the directors with, in addition to, for the love of God, please have enough porta potties and have them spread throughout the course. Porta potties really became like the joke of the weekend, which everyone who knows me, from like writing Saddle Sore to doing these like women's talks at bike shops to now talking about this, knows that I am so excited whenever I can bring up things like tampons and porta potties and digestive issues and all that fun stuff. But the big thing that I hope I left everyone with was this idea of what if we actually started seeing the women's race as the default race. And I think that just little syntactical shift, even in your brain, it doesn't have to be on the website, it doesn't have to be on paper, but just thinking about it where the women's race is the race instead of the race being the men's race, and then you have the women's race. The women's race is your race. And then the men's race is sort of this, the same way we talk about the race and the women's race. Now we can talk about the race and the men's race. Mm-hmm. And I think that really does make a shift in your brain about how you're looking at everything.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it sounded like a really fun sort of conversation, and it sounded like the race organizers were really open to the idea. And I had said to you beforehand that I think this is one of those things that, yes, it's like this other thing they have to do, but then it also strikes me as good business because there are lots of women who would participate in events as well. So there's, I think lots left on the table there as far as, if you do get porta potties or whatever the thing is, make it seem like an actual race they want to participate in. I think it's only upside.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually did. I grabbed the mic back from the moderator towards the end because she was talking about how, it's the right thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. And I grabbed the mic back and I was like, also, side note, like, this is economically the best thing you can do. Right. Like, this is just smart, as you say, like, this is just smart marketing. Mm-hmm. It just seems so silly to not speak to, half of the audience.
And I think, some of these stats are harder to find, but I know there was some of the ones around like the women's Tour de France and the Giro and stuff where like the viewership was quite high. And then I know like on Red Bull TV when they had the women's mountain biking and cyclocross, like a lot of years, those were, higher, even, right? And was that because Van der Poel was winning everything and it was sort of boring to watch the men's race? I don't know, but I think it's also that it's just really good, tight racing in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that's really exciting.
Well, side note, we have had equally dominant women, PFP, Marianne Vos. Like, it's not like women's cycling has not had ridiculous dominant forces like Van der Poel. So, yeah, I'm going to say it's just because women's racing is awesome. Okay. But yeah, so really, really exciting. And it's fun to get to do stuff like that and kind of communicate with new, different communities. I'm still sort of new to like the running side of things. So it was very cool to, meet a lot of people. And honestly, I will say, like, for all I'm up there talking about how race directors need to do X, Y, and Z and should be thinking about X, Y, and Z, it really, talking to a lot of them really did drive home the really important reminder that race directors are A, not making a lot of money for the most part, and B, like, they're in it because they love running, like, they're in it because they love cycling. So, this is like the reminder to thank the volunteers, thank the promoters, thank the event directors, etc. Because even when you do have an issue like not enough porta potties, they are trying their best, and they are in an industry that does not make a ton of money. Like, this is not a job where any of them were like pulling up in their Lamborghinis or anything like that.
Right. No, certainly not. Okay, well that's great. And so we have a couple questions today we're gonna go through. I think they're good questions. They're somewhat, I guess philosophical in places, but I think some practical takeaways as well.
Though before we get into it, I will throw out, a quick plug to our sponsor at Payable. If you are in fact a race director and you're trying to think of an easy way to take payments, bring in like your waivers, do all that stuff for your weekly race, highly recommend checking out the Payable add-on for Google Forms, which lets you take payments in a Google form. I know one of the questions that came up a lot was, I want to do training runs before the race, but we need to do some kind of registration from like a insurance and waiver and like risk indemnification perspective. And I mean, maybe you want to make a few extra bucks. So using Google Forms and the Payable add-on, super easy way. We love them over there. They're some of the greatest people, like literally the greatest people we know. So you can check that out, payableapps.com/athlete. And there's some perks for you if you check out that particular link, which we will drop in the show notes.
That's right. Yeah. And certainly works for something like a donation or as well. So like something like that example you said where it was like a free training run, but maybe you want to donate to the running club or, whatever.
Yeah, a lot of people were actually asking about ways to raise money for charities, stuff like that. This is again a really easy way of doing that. That just doesn't take a lot of extra time or effort.
And that's what our local mountain bike club uses it for, the membership, like to actually register for the club, but then also for things like trail donation. It just just an easy way to say like, this is what I want to donate to, $5, and then it checks out in a standard checkout sort of format.
Yeah, so check that out again, payableapps.com/athlete. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. And okay, now it's time to get philosophical. So this is a really great question and one we've been turning around a ton, just batting back and forth in conversation lately. Is maintaining performance the new progress after a certain age? And this, I think, if you're listening to this and you're just tuning in, if you go back a couple of episodes ago, we talked about heart rate, maximum heart rate, and VO2 max. And one thing we talked about is that, tradition, like the common thing you hear is, your max heart rate is 180 minus your age.
No, 220.
Or 220 minus your age, sorry. It's not that low. 220 minus your age, and then VO2 max goes down by about 10% every decade. And what we were saying is when you hear those numbers, like just press pause and remember that that's a population-based thing. That is not, the day you turn 40, your your max heart rate goes from 181 to 180. It doesn't click
Yeah,
over.
we were joking. It's not funny because like some people do ask the question and I understand why, but yeah, that like, oh, it's my birthday. Should we decrease my zones, like decrease my max heart rate because I'm another, year closer to death or something, So now it's 179 instead of 180 or whatever.
So definitely go back and listen to that episode for that kind of, more if you're thinking about your numbers and how to set them. But I think that really started this conversation of, at some point, like it is a bit of a fight to keep those numbers. And at some point, yes, like we are all trending to zero.
So I guess, so it's like this curve that we're all going to end up at zero. Right, I think we're acknowledging that it's uncomfortable, but I guess it's the slope of the curve, and then like at that very end, like the dream of this, they'll talk a lot about health span and lifespan now with the longevity, popularity, and all the books and all this, where you want to extend how long you're healthy. You're moving around, you're going on vacation, you're doing whatever you want to do, and then it sort of just abruptly ends, and that's sort of how I guess most of us dream of going. Right, it just sort of you don't even know, and then it's just done. Versus some sort of extended, sick sort of situation where you're sick for 2 decades laying in bed. I don't think that you wish that on anyone, right? And so that's sort of this concept of if we exercise, if we train, perhaps if we perform, which we should probably talk a bit about those sort of 3 words and definitions, we can sort of push that out. So as Molly said, it's a population level average. We're all trending downward. So if you took all the average across the world and you make a line, it's going to trend downward. But there's obviously a subset of people where they're pushing that curve up. I don't know if that works, but we're changing the slope of the curve so that like you don't decrease 10%, maybe you decrease 5% across certain decades.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about those 3 different kind of buckets before we get
Sure.
far into?
Just because the question said performance, right? And so I do think Dan John speaks a lot to this, but I think these sort of words make sense, but they do get, and I think increasingly so, this performance, like human performance. I know the Ready State crew it talks a lot about human performance, and you see these words, but to me, you want to be careful what you're describing, because you could say health, That's sort of like the function of organ systems or something like that, right? Like you're sort of healthy, right? You might not have any fitness, but you could be a healthy person. But then you could have fitness, and that's, Dan John has that lovely, like, it's like a puzzle, you're fit for the task, right? And so if you're a cyclist, you bike a lot, and then you get good at that. If and we could be even more specific. You're good at gravel cycling, or a short mountain bike race, or a Leadville type mountain bike race. What are you fit for? Are you fit for that task? And that can be changeable across a season. We talked about different peaks, I think, in the last podcast, right? And so fitness is something that evolves across the season and across, just what you're training for. I think that's maybe more what the question's even about. And then performance is more showing up, writing your name down, performing at a certain time in front of people. And you might have the best fitness in the world, and you might not perform well because you choke, or you get nervous, or your gut goes off, or there's better people there, right? Like if performance is actually winning. So I think it's worth thinking about that, because then you could say, well, could we get a world record when we're 100 years old? Right, which we'll talk about, my favorite study here in a second too. You could perform super well, but was that actually, like, are you fitter for the task of bicycling in the way you're setting this world record, or whatever world record you're going to set at the age of 100? You may not be actually fitter. You may have declined across decades, but you could perform at the world's best for someone in that competition, that 100-year or 80-year-old marathon record, or whatever you're going to do. So just sort of some ways to think about that. Like, you could be increasing your health, you could be becoming fitter for a task, you could be performing in a certain competition in a certain way. So just maybe it may be helpful to think about those different definitions.
Yeah, so really, you almost kind of need to rephrase the question, asking, is maintaining performance the new progress after a certain age? Obviously it depends. And what I'm thinking here is, we know plenty of people who are well into their 80s. Again, you're going to talk about a study of a 101 and then 103-year-old who continued to improve his performance. And again, yeah, he's not racing Matthew van der Poel and winning. He's racing other 100-year-olds and winning. We know tons of is pushing it, but like, we know many people in their 70s and 80s who are winning national championships. Like, you can't say they're not performing, or they're winning world championships. They're performing. They're just not beating their, like, 55-year-old counterparts or 40-year-old counterparts.
And I think in a lot of cases have good health too, right? Certainly versus age matched, right? And so this is, are we comparing to like age matched, or are we comparing to our 20-year-old selves as well? So it is tricky, right? And I think we're all sort of like, well, we don't want to give up our 20-year-old or 30-year-old power bests. We're speaking towards cycling here, but it could be running, like my marathon time or whatever, right? I'm always going to be a 3-hour marathoner. And then I don't know if that's always, at some point that's not going to be accessible, right? And so that would be the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, and redefining what health and performance looks like for you. I mean, both of us, I'll say maybe mine is a little more like stark. Like, we've changed our performance metrics over the years. Like, I'm a very different athlete now than I was when I was racing cyclocross, 15 years ago, or triathlon before that. I wouldn't say I'm like less of an athlete. I'd say I might arguably be better than I am, but I don't know, because I haven't raced a cyclocross race in a very long time. I haven't raced an Ironman in a very long time. So, like, on paper, my performance in cyclocross has decreased to 0.
Yeah,
but my performance,
is this the time of year where we start plotting our return to cyclocross?
We're coming back, 2025, my year.
About September 22nd, we decide we're not racing cyclocross.
To be fair, I would have come back this year.
Yeah, I don't know. The licensing is the main barrier.
It's true.
Which is unfortunate. Which it sort of leads to, you don't want to throw the race organizers and stuff. It's not their fault.
Well, it's not the race organizers in this case. Okay, the less we say about that, the better.
Okay. So, yeah. So this idea. So then I guess I want to just say this, like, actual question. So let's say, like, I guess the problem I have, and I mentioned this on the previous episode as well, where it's like this decline. What that decline assumes is that you've pushed yourself in whatever you're talking about. Let's use this as like a fitness thing. So you're going to do a classic 20-minute power test on your bike. A lot of people never really trained at a high level and didn't, might have not even biked when they were 20 or 30. So there's room to, you could call this, is this my genetic potential? Sometimes I'll have athletes who like lament that they've hit their genetic ceiling or something, which could be true, but that's not the worst place to be. You can ride that for a long time. And of course we can get better in a lot of ways, but for a lot of us, it's when we talk about VO2 max or these power bests, there's just, if you train, you can, wherever you are now, if you train more, in general, things will go up, right? Like the physiology doesn't stop because you're 50 or 55 or whatever age you are, right? In principle, if you train more, it will increase. It might be harder to see benefits, but that's, again, seasonally, we get a little less fit and then we get a bit more fit for the thing. But I think you always want to tie it back to like, do you want to be fit for that thing? And that fitness isn't necessarily tied again to health or even to performance, depending on what you're trying to perform in.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I do think, like, let's also reframe the idea of accept the fact that one is not progressing, but at least maintaining performance. Like, at least maintaining performance. If you're at, what you consider to be a pretty high level, like, if I stay at the level I am for another 10 years, I'm going to be freaking stoked. Like, that's going to be amazing.
Right.
Like, I don't think I have a lot left to gain. So if I can hold that, like, I'm really happy. Mm-hmm. The same is, like, we were kind of talking about this in terms of weight loss, and we're not suggesting that you need to lose weight in this, but just, if you hit your goal weight, like if you were, 200 and you wanted to be 180 and you hit 180, you wouldn't consider progress to be continuing to drop down if 180 was your goal. Like, winning in that wouldn't be going down to 170 and then 160. Like, that would be actually counter to your goal.
Right.
So, like, in that case, you're actually, like, the point is to hit that and then maintain it. Mm-hmm. So I really don't see anything wrong with maintaining your fitness. It's, like, it's ridiculous to assume that we're always going to be on an upswing forever.
Yeah, and weight's the most obvious one, and it's relevant for some people for sure. And I think that's another one where like that isn't health and that isn't fitness. Maybe there's like correlates there in places, but we want to be careful there. But I think it is an example where a lot of people would just want to maintain their weight. They would be happy there. That's probably true. I don't know. Maybe that's not true. But
isn't that a Dan John thing where it's like, as you get older, if you can just avoid gaining the like average like 5 pounds a year that people tend to start?
That's essentially his thing, because like most people, again, on the average, like most people gain whatever, like a pound a year or something, right? Like on average. And so like everyone, by the time you're 60, like you've gained 20 pounds, you're 20 pounds overweight or whatever the thing is, right? So his joke is actually like your goal should be to lose a pound, be 1 pound lighter. If weight loss is your goal, and then people say, well, that's not enough. And he says, well, most people just don't succeed in losing weight, so that it would be, so it's sort of like a tongue-in-cheek thing because most people don't succeed in losing weight. But in any case, let's get off of weight a little bit and think, indeed, there's things that we would maintain. And so it's something like, again, if you're someone who's been training consistently for years, you may not see a ton of improvement in your power fitness, your fitness for cycling or your paces in running, but your goal every year might be to get to that approximate limit, right? I call this getting to spitting distance of those bests before an event. So if we knew that you could run, now that you've run these 5K, fast 5Ks we've been joking about the last few weeks, it might be to run, say you run what's a fast one, like 16 or something, I don't know.
Sure, I could do that.
So then it might be just to get close to that, right? I'm only using 5 because it's like in that realm of 20-minute powers that we always talk about. And so it just like get it close, and then in the race, use your fitness and really like spend those matches or whatever is probably a good idea, right? And that's sort of like if you've been training consistently across many years, that maintenance wouldn't be a bad thing in my mind. It would be, maybe there's something you're trying to improve or make a little different, or like really put a focused training block in. You're going to really go after 5-minute power or 1-minute power. And so you're doing intervals, and then you're going to test that and try and beat it or again, just get close to it. And so you'll see that again, that's sort of this idea that like, as we get older, a lot of times there's like aging, like the effects of aging. And then there's also like, a lot of times we just get lazy and don't want to do things understandably anymore. Right. That's, you talked about 70 and 80-year-old people we know who are riding. And in a lot of cases, there's like this, they'll go and do events, and then they say, oh, I'm done with events. And then they go back to doing events. and I get it. Right. And they're amazing because whatever they're doing is just like so cool. But there's that like, you don't want to do intervals and intensity anymore. So the problem with a lot of the studies and things are that most people stop training essentially, right? They might still ride, but they're not really training anymore as we get older, right? I think that's true. Like a lot of us, whether it's college sport, then we give up college sport. Or like you used to race bikes, but I didn't really like it once I got into masters and I stopped racing bikes. I had kids or went on vacations or whatever happens in life. So it's hard to untangle those, like that's like more like, is it genetic or is it like your environment's changed? And it's not always apparent to us as people stuck in our environments that indeed like, oh yeah, I used to go to that hill twice a week and just drill it. And now I don't ever drill it anymore, right? I see that a lot where people like love zone 2, and it's like, well, you sort of just love going slow is what, you like all day pace and you like going and stopping for a coffee, which is, I 100% get it. But that's the challenge, in the Peter Attia stuff and all of these, Joe Friel's Fast After 50. I had a couple athletes just rediscover the Fast After 50 books, which are great. And if we had to, and any of the Stacy Sims and the Roar and the Celine Yeager menopause type stuff, right? If we had to boil this down and simplify it, which you shouldn't do, it's like strength training, plyometrics, VO2 intervals, high intensity intervals,
all the stuff you kind of don't want to do at any age, especially
right.
as you get older.
Right. And so that's like, well, what are they doing? Well, they're trying to say you got to keep training. And so that's like our sort of push too, is like, well, how do we keep you interested in training? And this might be a change in sport. It might be a change in discipline. It might be going more like social, like just something that's like a boot camp hit type thing that like forces you to do it. Some people, it's been the Zwift stuff has been great, right? Where it's like they just enter the group ride and they just go as hard as they can in their house, right? And that's safety is a factor as we get older too. You don't want to be in a criterium race necessarily, right? So that's the thing is like we want to think like is there things in our environment we can change if you do want to keep progressing or maintaining, you need to keep doing the stuff, right? There's no free lunch or there's the use it or what is it, use it or lose it.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, I think this is a good time to bring up the study we keep mentioning with the 101 and then 103-year-olds. So
and it's like a case study, so we should be careful. It's like a one-off person.
Yeah, obviously it depends, blah, blah, blah. You're an individual. But I think it's just, to me, so cool to see. So basically, this is a study that showed for the first time that VO2 max, maximal oxygen consumption, and performance can both still be increased. So this 101-year-old then, first set, I believe he set the, hour record.
Beat himself.
Beat himself at 101.
2 years later, yeah.
So he set it at 101 and then beat it at 103. Mm-hmm. And he rode almost 27K in an hour. Mm-hmm. Let's just reflect on that for a second. There are many, even reasonably
Well, they
fit,
compare, you're just looking at the one thing I put in there, but in the study they compare, that's faster than, the VO2 max values rather are higher than, I think it was 50 to 60 year olds or 40 to 60 year old. I think is than the average population, it's a higher VO2 max. So
bearing in mind over 34 for VO2 max is considered beyond excellent in pretty much, I think that's the highest you really see on any of the charts for any of the ages is after you hit 34 in your VO2 max,
and the
it's
rest,
they're thumbs up, you're great, you're excellent.
Right. So we want to look past that, right? Again, in light of this VO2 max being predictive of, mortality and morbidity. But I think this is he increased his VO2 max. And I always question, because the VO2 max is often expressed in relative terms, so relative to your body weight. And so what they could have done is made him lose a bunch of weight. And then if he somehow performed as well, he could have had a higher VO2 max, but in fact he pushed more power and had very minimal change in his body mass and composition, which actually at 101 to 103 is pretty awesome that he maintained his. Again, is maintenance a good thing? Well, actually in this case he maintained his muscle mass essentially, and fat-free mass. Fat-free mass and fat mass. So he didn't have change in body composition. So again, is maintenance a bad thing? No, that's actually tremendous, especially when you're over 100, to be held on. But then he also saw improvement, and it was 20 watts. If we want to stop talking in, it went from 83 watts to 100 watts, which is not a lot of watts. But again,
it's
at 100,
not a lot of watts.
Yeah, really, really cool. And I think we'll get into that quality on the next question, right? We have another question, but I just want to put that out there that like one of the factors I like too is that they worked a lot on his case because it's fixed gear on the track, right? This was a 1 hour record, so it's like fixed gear on the track, and so they worked a lot on his cadence because I think he pedaled very slowly, and so like there's also this quality. How did you do the effort? How did you do the power? Which is like another. How could we improve? It's not always like, well, you only do 200 watts in your CP20. And now it's 190 watts. Well, how much struggle? Where did you do it? What was the form? Like, I think those are all other ways that we could improve as well.
For sure, yeah. And actually, I wrote down here experience over age or experience versus age. I think, again, coming back to the question, this is maintaining performance the new progress after a certain age? I would actually almost like challenge the person to think about, instead of thinking about getting older, think about getting more experienced. Like, you've done that mountain bike race a few times. You've done more reps of your bunny hop, of your like rolling over the log, rolling over the roots, or you can get through the technical stuff better. You always talk about an older guy on a group ride when you were younger who like managed to stay with the A group for like way longer than his body type or like fitness level like dictated. Adam Meyerson has talked about this a billion times with crit racing. Like, he's not the strongest guy in the pack by far, but he is the most technically skilled in a lot of these cases. Like,
tactically. He's good technically too, but like, yeah, his tactics are very good in her criteria.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, same, you saw Laura Van Gilder winning crit races well into her 50s against, young women who certainly would have had higher watts, but tactically and technically, she was just head and shoulders above the rest because she'd done so many reps of it. Mm-hmm. So even this 101-year-old, when he first set the record at 101, he had less experience. When he hit 103, he'd done it before. He knew what he was, going after. He'd had 2 years to tweak and improve, and he had that experience. So, it's like the cliche of like, you're not getting older, you're just getting more like well seasoned. Mm-hmm. But I think if you can kind of think about that in your training and think about what you can change, like maybe yes, you at some point you're gonna be getting a little bit slower, you're gonna slow down a little bit, but you can, like you say, do the intervals and do the strength stuff, but you can also do a lot of the technical and tactical skills. Like,
well, in tactics, those. Like if there was like, what does experience give you is like tactics, strategies and tactics, right? And so I would say like for me, that's this year in gravel, like I've never been great with tactics at all as a mountain biker. It didn't really matter originally. And then now with gravel though, like it's mostly like road racing. So you do have to be, a little smart. You can't just be like randomly attacking and, pulling everyone around and so forth. So that this year has been like great for me to just have to be a little smarter. And again, because I can't just power away when I was 20, I could have had more power. But now that everyone else is 20, it's like forced me to spend time on that. And so then to see improvement in my strategy and tactics, even, aside from the result, right? I can see like, oh, like I was able to stick in that when like in the past I wouldn't, and it wasn't because I overpowered someone, it was because I like outsmarted them or like put myself in a better position, expended the fitness I have at the right moment for a better result, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's really interesting. You said something about there that I thought the performance though was also relevant. Like I guess that's what I'm saying is the question here was about performance when you get older, and so indeed you could be smarter or better technically or tactically. Certainly you might have money to buy equipment that makes you better and perform better as well. So there's a lot of these things that indeed could see a better performance, but perhaps also your fitness is not as high, right? Mm-hmm. So again, that's where these different definitions are important, because like performance, you could still perform on the day. It just might be all these complex things that are coming together, or this complex system of your event. It might just be a slightly different way that you end up at the end, mm-hmm. right? And that's why I love off-road especially, is that there's just so many of these factors that can make or break the day, right? It's overwhelming, but it's also really neat because mm-hmm. you can get better in a lot of different ways.
For sure. Yeah. And okay, so I think let's maybe move into our other question of the day, because this sort of relates. Question was, I can't finish my workouts. Is my threshold set too high? And I think this does come to kind of that weird query of like for performance and fitness, because, you know, on one hand, you want your threshold to be high because that indicates that you have, and I'm putting air quotes around here, it indicates that your fitness level is super high. But if you can't actually hit the numbers in your workouts, your performance actually is like decreased. So this is almost like a performance fitness mismatch from like a mental like hurdle standpoint.
Yeah, I was telling you before we got recording here that I feel like I had like a mental breakthrough, and I don't know, it's not like I had that much anguish. I do finish my workouts most times. But I just had this like epiphany where I was just like, why struggle? Just back off and do the work, and you don't need to be at the limit and like just back off. I don't know, there was a very odd sort of like epiphany I had.
Did you have that like on the hill, like while you were going up
Well,
it?
I mean, it's on the trainer right now. I don't want to
Oh,
speak about
ugh.
that part of my life, but yeah. So I was on the trainer, and so yeah, and I mean, training's been going well, but I think it's like to this thing, like that threshold. I always go threshold, and then I go asterisk, asterisk, setting, all in bold or all in capitals, asterisk, asterisk, because I'm trying to draw the attention to the fact that this is a setting. It's not you. It's not your performance. You know, is it somewhat correlated? Maybe, depending on your, you know, or probably somewhat correlated, but like, you know, variable depending on the event you do and, you know, whatever, right? And so it's so dependent on the trainer and the setting that you're in. You know, are you indoors or outdoors, or is this a power meter or a trainer? So it's sort of just finding the resistance level, you know, like we used to do on the spin bike. You know, you're in spin class and you'd turn the knob a little bit to a 3, but like you were definitely on a 1 because you didn't want to work that hard and the spin instructor didn't know. This is sort of the same thing. I think, you know, so long as it's feeling the right way and you're getting through the workout as it was designed, you know, you can't be lazy, but you also don't need to struggle and like have this stress that comes with it, right? And so I think if you're not making it through the workout, probably it's just set too high. So just knock it down. And I think you'll find that it's great, right? And we had talked about, you know, sort of this idea of quality and stuff there. Did you want to go there now, or what do you think?
Yeah. Do you want me to just read off these like things that you word vomited on here?
No, that's okay. I guess let me ask you a question. So you're out running. Like I often bring cyclists back and I say, you know, cross-country skiers are the fittest people in the world, right? And they have the highest VO2 max. And most of the time they can't actually cross-country ski, you know, because the snow sucks or they're not in the mountains. So they have to run or they have to do other sports. But they somehow still do intervals. They do lots of intervals. Cross-country skiers do lots and lots of intervals. Very similar in a lot of ways to cycling intervals, like as far as durations and stuff. I don't know if that's because cyclists end up copying what the cross-country skiers do or what. But it's very curious. And runners would be similar, right? They sort of try to have power, but I don't know that that's still working out very well for them. So when you go and do your efforts, like what do? Do you just run vigorously?
I just run vigorously. I am not a heart rate person. I am a perceived exertion person.
Okay.
So, yeah, I just
So you're
run hard.
running for an extended period of time, and then at some point, you know, you have a set of intervals. Mm-hmm. Do you remember like a recent sort of interval you did?
Yeah, last week I had 8 sets of 3 minutes on, 2 minutes recovery. So like 3 minutes hard, 2 minutes recovery, and then a bunch of 30-second
Sort of like
after
thresholdy VO2 maxi.
Yeah.
Right there on that sort of limit, you know, the shorter recovery. So that's a great set, you know, so 8x3, that's a lot. It's a lot of sets. It's a lot. So you just went a little faster for 3 minutes?
Pretty much.
Yeah, and like maybe you were breathing a little heavy or something?
Pretty much.
You probably wanted to stop during it, but you kept going.
I said it on a podcast that I was on last week when I was recording it that I really only have 2 speeds on the run. It's hard or it's the other speed.
Okay. Yeah, and so that's I think sometimes when we back up, you're on your indoor trainer and you're staring at this number on the, you know, that's power. Just remember, like if you were outside and you just went vigorous for the amount of time you're supposed to be working hard and then backing off, like would you finish this workout, right? Or is there something so wrong with you that like you wouldn't, right? Are you very tired? Did you not sleep at night?
See, I have thought this is like the issue I have with Zwift, or any, this is not Zwift alone, this is any virtual training platform, is that like, you know, 10 years ago, you had your power on your little like computer head. On
yeah,
your,
lots of
if
people
you were
didn't.
lucky,
Yeah.
on your screen. And yeah, like I almost never had, like I had power for like a year maybe on my bike. I currently actually don't have a power meter on my bike. I just have the smart trainer when I'm on it. But point being, we didn't have power. Maybe we had it just on the computer on the bike.
Right.
And then we were watching a movie or a show or a race or whatever. And I think probably back, it would be funny. It'd be an interesting thing for Training Peaks to pull this data and look at like the rate of like successful workouts.
It'd be
Like
hard, yeah, but
prior
that would
to
be.
virtual training environments, because I bet you that when you couldn't, like when that just wasn't a thing that you stared at, people finished their workouts more because they didn't see the number and get super depressed. They just did the damn workout.
Well, and that's what I'm sort of saying here is that a lot of times, everyone has lots going on in their lives. They're tired, whatever, fueling, yada yada. But a lot of times there's like this expectation that I'm going to do 200 watts and I'm doing 190 watts and I suck, so I'm going to quit. Something must be wrong.
This is actually like great because a couple weeks ago we were at my parents. We were on a different trainer, and I was saying the trainer was reading really low, and it was like I was saying it didn't bother me, but it bothered me
100%.
a lot.
Yeah.
And like honestly, it made the 90 minutes I was on there just seem like it took forever. It just felt like crap because I'd be like trying my damnedest, and it would be like 115 watts. Just like giving me the middle finger, and it felt crappier as a result. And then I came back here and I'm on the trainer here and same effort level, and it's showing me like 150, 160, whatever. Like the wattage that feels like that seemed like, okay, that's about what I was doing. And even though in New Jersey, I knew that I was pushing like a harder number of watts, the number being low on the screen was completely wrecking my like mental, like emotional performance and making it feel a lot harder physically.
For sure.
And then coming here, like, yeah, suddenly I'm like, oh, okay, like I don't suck. This is fine. And I felt totally fine through the like ride.
Yeah, it is odd that you can't, and maybe if someone knows this is a way, something you can do, but I haven't seen, obviously you could put like a piece of tape over it, I guess, on your TV screen, but, where you could remove power, right? I really we've talked about Training Peaks Virtual, I think,
Yeah.
where I like it because there's no mention of watts per kilogram. It's all just power, which I think is healthier for me at least. But I would love if it was just, you could remove power and like the power still like, is needed to make the game work and like move you around this virtual
Well, just
world.
record it, but you don't need to see it the whole time.
Don't even record it. I don't know. Just like use it to move me around or something. I don't know. So in any case, I think what I will say, you asked about like Training Peaks data. I will say that I have probably 5 or 6 athletes still who just, do the old speed and distance on the, rear wheel sensor on their trainer. And honestly, I don't know. Some of them are the busiest people I work with, like the most time limited people, like big commutes, dogs or kids they have to take care of, or sometimes both, stressful jobs, everything. And I swear to God, they get the workouts done, whether, just all the time, they just get it done.
Yeah, so I think sometimes, it is removing the metrics that are making you feel as though you're failing your workouts.
For sure. So I think, the idea would be to set the threshold appropriately. So a lot of times it's, it's the fall, just set it lower. I just set mine. I don't even necessarily test it. I just set it lower and get in there and start training. And does it feel very good, right? Does it feel like, I'm in the middle of the suggested range or zone? Or am I, just, working a little too hard to stay in the zone or you know what I mean? Or is heart rate drifting too much? Am I struggling to make it happen? And then I think the reason that we like this is that then you have some freedom where you can be a bit more variable. So variable could be the terrain or your attention or the cadence you're using, the position you use. Like you could spend some time in the drops or in your aero bars or whatever. You could just play around a bit more in at endurance pace, but then also you're up doing sweet spot. If your sweet spot is actually like threshold or VO2 effort because your threshold setting is too high, you can't, you have to be pinned, right? So you have very little strategies, very little variability. They talk about in a lot of like the coaching and different research that I love to follow. As you get towards like 100 mile an hour, like fastball, like a fast fastball in baseball, there's only so many ways to throw that ball. But as you start throwing more casually, right, you could start thinking you could go underhand, you could go sidearm, you could go like a little flick of the wrist here. Does that make sense? So if you then take that idea that like as you're maxing out, there's only so like we're all just pinned, right? And this is where like you just look like you look when you're doing this like max effort. So if you back off of that, you have more freedom to be variable and play around. And then you also can do different things. So you use a slightly higher cadence that's a little uncomfortable for you. You could, again, just look like we talked about, like looking like you're, looking cool, or looking like you could say good posture, whatever that is.
Well, we always come back to when we were on the Ingamba trip in Italy this past October. The one thing the guide said toward the end of the ride is that, the ride finishes at the top of this hill. So you're riding up this hill at the very end of a ride. So you're kind of like in the part where you should be cooling down and like chilling out and like ready to roll in. And he was talking about, sometimes on the tour you have like the guys that want to hot dog it up the hill, that want to like speed up the hill as fast as they can, or like beat him up the hill or whatever. And he was like, he's not elegant. And I really dig the idea of being elegant, especially like, when you finish your intervals, can you still feel, like you say, like you have good form on the bike, like you have good posture, like you're elegant.
Mm-hmm. So when you're slamming out intervals, it can be tempting to stand and, maybe hunch over a lot or do something like that, which, this is sort of this training environment where we can try and be a little more perfect. Same way as we're doing squats, right? Like in a competition, you're squatting, you might have to do something irregular. A hockey player coming into a corner might end up in a squat-like position and then have to come out of that. So in the same way, I think, we're climbing on our mountain bike and we're maxed out in a race is different than when we're preparing. We don't want to have that same struggle, right? In the same way, again, using the squatting analogy, you might not grind super hard in the gym or really like use everything. You're going to have a nice set of 5x5 they talk about as it starts to slow down and your perceived exertion goes up on the squat. So I think with the bike intervals, it's sort of similar. You want it to be hard, but not this maximal effort, especially if the intervals aren't actually supposed to be maximal. If this is supposed to be moderate, your tempos, your sweet spots, and even your thresholds, there's always supposed to be this extra gear or two above where it's TT or VO2 or anaerobic or sprinting over top of this. So I think we want to be careful that we're achieving the goals of the workout, both in terms of the perceived exertion that we're expecting, and that's desirable, and then certainly that we want to finish the workout. That's, this idea of time and zone often gets missed. We've talked about zone 2 and logging time in that zone. That's really the idea. If you're doing zone 4 threshold intervals or zone 5 VO2 intervals, a lot of times people want to push over that because you can, right? There's zones, they're not maximals, the maximal, so people will push over, but that's not logging time in that zone. So whatever you're supposed to be doing, you want to think about putting in the time, and then if you can't put in the time, to the question that we started off with here, then certainly I would just back that threshold setting or your zone setting, however you're setting your zones, just down a little bit so that you can achieve it, and again with that sort of elegance or that form in mind.
Perfect. Love it. All right. Cut, set, print. As always, thanks for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Do us a huge favor, head over to wherever you listen to this and just quickly take 10 seconds, subscribe, rate, review, etc. It is very, very helpful to us. And with that, we will see you next week. Happy training. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.